Welcome to Legal Resources Radio, where we invite you into the world of social justice, advocacy, and public interest law. Throughout this podcast series, we'll share stories, insights, and expert advice from our dedicated team at the Legal Resources Centre, as well as from our valued guests. In each episode, we'll dive into the legal landscape, tackle pressing social issues, and aim to empower you with the knowledge to make a difference. Whether you're a community activist, a legal professional, passionate about social justice, or just curious, this is the place for you. So wherever you are, washing dishes, at work, on the bus, train, or plane, or just relaxing at home, plug in your headphones, take a deep breath, and get ready to begin.
Welcome to the Legal Resources Radio, a podcast hosted by the Legal Resources Centre. This is our 7th episode, I think. And as I'm sure you're aware, you've maybe noticed the trend of our last 6 podcasts. We've been, delving really into the digital space, specifically around digital justice and realizing that within a South African, and global context. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about tech-facilitated gender-based violence. I know that's a wordy description, but I'm not going to define it. Not here in the intro, at least. I'm going to let our amazing guest define it for you. Our guest is Jaimee Kokonya. She is from Nairobi, Kenya. She works as an Africa campaigner at Access Now, and she has an LLB from the University of Nairobi. This topic is really important to us here at the Legal Resources Centre and to other organizations that we work with globally and domestically. The online space used to be this sort of safe haven, this campaigner, activist safe haven for people that were trying to express their identities but also realize human rights in an online space. It's now become kind of like a festering pit of right-wing politics and anti-gender movement rhetoric. And that's a really alarming thing for a lot of us in this sector and just, everyday people online. We're seeing LGBTQIA persons, we're seeing refugee persons, we're seeing LGBTQIA refugees targeted and marginalized within the online space. And so today, Jaimee and I are going to have a conversation about how tech facilitates this violence. We're seeing it coming in 2 ways. Either it's people of this nature being targeted specifically online and seeing hate in the text online, or we're seeing the text online spreading misinformation, hate speech, disinformation, and pushing people to commit violence on the ground offline. But that's enough from me. We're going to be joining Jaimee Kokonya online. She's coming in from Nairobi. Please excuse my eye contact. Sometimes I'm looking at you guys, sometimes I'm looking at Jaimee, but we're just trying to have some fun here. But I hope you enjoy it. Off to Jaimee. Hello, Jaimee. How are you?
I'm well, Kemal. Thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. And thank you so much for joining us all the way from Nairobi. I just want to say that before we get into the topic for today, I kind of wanted to get a sense of who you are. So maybe if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself. Did you grow up in Nairobi, or did you grow up somewhere else? How did you then get involved in the digital justice space? I'm very interested.
Yeah, I did. I've been born and raised in Nairobi my whole life. So I actually didn't really start in the digital rights space. I kind of found myself here by mistake. But I went to law school thinking that I was going to be a human rights lawyer, watching Suits and thinking, oh my God, this is so fun. I'm going to go to court and, tell guilty people really bad things about themselves. But got to law school and did my criminal and civil procedure and decided, this is kind of boring. Don't want to do that. um, so I still decided that I wanted to work in human rights, but more in civil society. So I joined an organization called HIVOS. It's like a Dutch organization that's also a funder in the human rights space, and that's kind of where I got my start in human rights. But after a couple of years, I was like, I think I want something different, but I wasn't really sure what that was going to be. And at the time, I was also like working in community organizations in Nairobi with like activists working on police brutality and stuff like that. So when we would have to organize protests, for example, there's a lot of like safety stuff that we would have to do to try to, mitigate either people being targeted by the police, um, or just how to keep safe in Nairobi during protests, maybe like to circumvent things like surveillance. So that kind of piqued my interest in terms of tech. And then I saw an opening at Access Now, and I was like, I think this would be good for me. And that's where I've been for the past 4 years now.
I see a lot of similarity between your story and my story. I mean, I think I always wanted to do human rights law, but I think when I got into it, I just realized that the tech space like kind of encapsulates the entirety of everything that we were doing here at the LRC. So I can look at any kind of the programs or projects that we're doing here and relate it specifically as well to it being online as well. So the previous podcast that we did, I spoke to a colleague of mine about how the Expropriation Act here in South Africa had like blown up and went viral online, and people were spreading misinformation, disinformation. It got into hate speech rhetoric as well. So I think it's a really interesting space, and I think also kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit today is how it's completely unregulated. So it's a part of society, right, that's not very dissimilar to what we see in everyday life, but it's online with no laws almost,
Yeah.
But we're here to talk about a very specific part of the online space. You and I both sat on a panel discussion about a month ago, and we spoke about tech-facilitated gender-based violence. So I've kind of spoiled it there in the way that I know that, or the audience, I suppose, knows that I've also kind of written a small paper on this. But for the audience sake, Jaimee, can you kind of tell us a little bit about what is tech-facilitated gender-based violence?
Yeah, so when we talk about tech facilitated gender based violence, we're talking about instances where we have like perpetrators online committing violence or abuse. This can be like domestic violence, harassment, stalking, doxing, things like non consensual intimate imagery that people still unfortunately refer to as revenge porn. They should stop doing that. Impersonation, extortion online. So those are some of the things that we have been working on as part of the campaign that I'm running at Access Now, which we're calling the Protect LGBT Rights campaign, because it's something that we had noted when a lot of organizations are talking about tech facilitated gender based violence. Most of it focuses on women, and not necessarily sexual and gender minorities. When we look at the kind of cases that us and our partners have been documenting, it's a space where these marginalized groups are experiencing so much violence, and it doesn't seem that that's making it into the mainstream conversation about TFGBV. So yeah, that's what we're trying to do with the work that we're doing at Access Now, to bring sexual and gender minorities more into the forefront of that conversation, for people to have more of an awareness of what the community is going through, but also to kind of make the discussions about whether it's the risks or the solution more intersectional, because it doesn't seem like that is what's happening at the moment.
And I think that caveat in your work is really important because, and it's a very similar conversations we're having here in South Africa about this expansion of the definition of gender as we understand it today in social situations, but maybe doesn't quite translate into legal or political situations. And this was, I mean, part of what we were talking about at the LGBTQIA refugee convening that you joined us here in Cape Town for. And I think what's interesting there is this idea of like, what is tech facilitated, right? So from on the one hand, it's like you actually see gender-based violence against marginalized groups, women, children, but specifically in this case, LGBTQIA people online itself. And then we're seeing tech facilitated in a way that like violence is being pushed because of the rhetoric online. So you see physical violence on the ground because of rhetoric that's being pushed there. So I'm really interested in the papers that you've written on this, and specifically the findings that you had on the increased risks that LGBTQIA people face due to the technology and the harassment and the hate speech and the disinformation online. I'm thinking specifically your rainbow burning publication.
Yeah, so I think like when I joined Access Now in 2021, um, initially I hadn't really figured out what I wanted my focus to be in terms of campaigning, but it just came up coincidentally that that was around the time that the anti-LGBT bill in Ghana had come up. And so we'd gotten into contact with Rightify Ghana, which is still our main partner in Ghana on LGBT issues. And through that, we were able to like now begin the documentation, but also engaging with the partners on the ground about the tech facilitated gender based violence that they had been documenting. And when we got to, I think it was 2023, we noticed that a similar law had come up in Uganda, a similar law had come up in Kenya, and at the same time that these laws were coming up, the online hate and violence had also really escalated to a concerning level. So that's when I decided that it would probably be a good idea for us to document what's happening online, but also specifically to test the social media platforms, content moderation mechanisms to see how well or how badly they're moderating anti LGBT content in sub Saharan Africa. So we began the documentation from 2023 to even now, currently in 2025. We published the Rainbow Burning report late last year. So we documented about 214 posts from X, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and WhatsApp, although WhatsApp isn't a social media platform, but we included WhatsApp because in Ghana, for example, the community had noted that a lot of the bad faith anti LGBT perpetrators had infiltrated the dating apps. And because of that, people are now using WhatsApp groups as, I guess, kind of their own ad hoc man-made dating apps, but those spaces had been infiltrated as well. So a lot of the entrapment was still happening within those WhatsApp groups. So that's why we included WhatsApp in our report as well. So the most concerning thing that I noted for me when I was doing the documentation is Access Now does have a digital security helpline, which is an escalation channel that we use to contact many of the social media platforms when people come to us. When partners like Rightify Ghana come to us with issues, whether it's like people being attacked online or people being doxxed or other things. And through those escalation channels, most of the time the platforms will take action. But it's very rare that a lot of the people that have access to these platforms in sub-Saharan Africa also have access to a helpline like Access Now. So the platform's in-app reporting mechanisms are kind of like the first line of defense that a lot of people have online. So what we wanted to do with this report is to test the efficacy of these reporting mechanisms. So what I would do is that I would go online and use specific keywords in English or in other local languages to find potential anti-LGBT content online, and then I would report them myself in the in-app mechanisms and then document the responses that I get if I would get responses because sometimes I wouldn't. And then for some of them, we would also report them directly to the platforms to see where we would get responses. So, what we noted in the report is that for the majority of the actually, I would say 90% of the content that I reported through in-app mechanisms, none of it was taken down. But most of the posts that were taken down, which I think were about 23% of the 214 posts in total, um, the ones that we reported directly to the platforms, those ones were taken down. And that's concerning for us because to me, it seems that for people who only have access to the in app reporting mechanisms, that means that this violating content will likely not be taken down. And in situations where we had posts, for example, with members of parliament in Kenya and in Ghana calling for LGBT people to be killed or to be banished from their communities, it's very dangerous. And even on TikTok, one of our partners from Ethiopia is the one that reached out to us about the doxing that had been happening on TikTok. And with one of the cases, someone who was doxed on TikTok was also assaulted by their classmates offline, and they had to actually be forced to flee Ethiopia because of the violence that they experienced. So when we have high likelihood of violence happening offline, then that means that these are things that platforms should be taking seriously, but it clearly seems that they are not. So that's some of the things that we wanted to document in this report, and the trends in disinformation as well. In Kenya, we had the Reject Finance Bill protests last year, and we noted that there was a lot of AI generated images with pictures of like people of the same sex kissing, and people saying that the Gen Z protests have been infiltrated by the gays because they know that if they create that narrative, then that will lead to people not supporting the protests anymore. Um, yeah, but very concerning, definitely.
I wanted to just have a follow-up question. You mentioned that the in-app reporting mechanism was quite unsuccessful, but then there was some other form of reporting. So was that like you were noting certain posts and then directly sending them? Was it like via email or to the tech platforms complaint mechanism? How did those other types of complaints work?
So for some, like the posts in Ghana, for example, the ones from Ghana or Ethiopia, what we did is with the Ethiopia one, I'll use that as an example. So when the partners reached out to us, we translated the content and then we reported them via our helpline directly to TikTok. So when we reported directly through TikTok, then the account was taken down. With the posts from Ghana, our partner also has direct contact with Meta. So they usually report to the helpline and to Meta directly. So when they use Access Now's escalation channel and report to Meta directly, then those posts would be taken down. But when we report via the in-app mechanisms, we note that sometimes we wouldn't get responses at all, and sometimes they just wouldn't be taken down.
I mean, I think that's really interesting. I think it's for two reasons. One, the language element. So you had to actually translate the posts yourself in order to put it in a palatable language for the big tech companies to actually take note of what the content said. I mean, we did a very similar tests in here in South Africa, and we translated 10 posts into three of South African languages that aren't English. So it was Afrikaans, isiXhosa, and isiZulu. And it was almost unanimous that those, specifically the African language, isiXhosa and isiZulu, were not picked up at all. And so it's very interesting that you had to obviously translate it for them and also then have the connections to them to then actually, get something noticed, even though they put up these in-app mechanisms for us.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned we've seen very similar risks here in South Africa, but specifically around migrants. And I think And I think, linking it back to our LGBTQIA refugee convening that we had, I think what's interesting there is we see this kind of double jeopardy for migrants here in South Africa. You mentioned at the top these laws that have been put up recently, or at least in the recent past. And we've obviously seen a lot of people from Uganda, Zimbabwe, etc., coming into South Africa because of our so-called good, refugee or asylum seeker system. But a lot of what the evidence that we collected over the last couple of months and what you and other partners have revealed to us is that, it's not as safe as it seems. And just because people come here because our constitution is amazing, they're still finding, stopgaps there because people at Home Affairs or people at the border post they don't consider persecution of LGBTQIA persons as a recognizable refugee claim issue. And so we see, risk from a tech facilitated point of view here in South Africa on both fronts. I don't know if you know this, Jaimee, but South Africa has got a lot of xenophobic rhetoric, and it's specifically online, and it's every election period. It's the same thing. They're always the kind of scapegoat. We're going to talk about scapegoats a little bit later, but just to point, I just wanted to ask, this queer-phobia and xenophobia, how do you see this kind of intersection of this rhetoric and how it materializes online?
Yeah, I there's a lot of connection, and I think with the rainbow burning report, essentially, what we were examining obviously is the online hate and violence that we're seeing online, but also trying to get to an understanding of why is it at this moment that we're seeing a lot of this anti-LGBT online hate and violence happening. And we've noticed that a lot of the push for this rhetoric is coming from, specific religious and political actors. And these are specific religious and political actors that are affiliated with the anti-rights movement globally. But something that is concerning about the political scapegoating is that, this framing about LGBT people as foreign agents, or with the framing of homosexuality as something foreign that is being imposed on Africa that is very un-African. Essentially, what they're aiming to do is to, exclude queer people from national identity. And, that's the same thing that we see in the connections between queer-phobia and xenophobia as well, you know. And when it comes to migrants, even something that has been documented in Kenya is situations where if we have, people fleeing Uganda, for example, and coming to seek refuge in Kenya, it's still difficult for them to get the, refugee status, because there's this narrative also that's created that people will lie and say that they're queer just so that the process can be expedited. And that's something that carries over also into the refugee determination process, which is really concerning. And even when we look at some of the tactics that, RSD adjudicators use to determine people's identity, maybe by looking at the content that they post online, if it's illegal for people to express their identity online, then it would be kind of impossible to use that as a metric or as a tool to determine whether people are lying about their identity or not. Um, but even in terms of queer people expressing themselves online, there's always a narrative that's created. I've seen this a lot, like in Ghana, and I mean in Uganda and in Kenya, where if you're a part of a human rights organization or are known to be like an LGBT activist, or are just a queer person who expresses themselves online, there'll always be these comments, people telling you maybe like, oh, which organization is paying you? Why are you trying to recruit people into homosexuality? Which, I mean, is is really ridiculous that people would actually believe that that's something that happens. But this insistence on, making sure that people understand queerness as something that is very foreign and very separate from, if we are identifying as Kenyan, South African, or even African as generally, that you're not included in what we consider our national or regional identity, which is something that I think is really concerning. But I think the biggest thing I would say we have seen that, like, we need to, I guess, interrogate more as well is where that narrative comes from, and also understanding why it's being used in political context. Because even if you'd noted, like in the Ghana elections last year, there was these campaigns that were running where, the opposition party was saying that if you vote for the ruling party, that's a vote for homosexuals. um, because these people, they don't want to pass the anti-homosexuality bill, and so if you vote for them, this is a vote for homosexuality. These people are trying to impose this on Ghana. So, it's something that people have seen is very useful to distract people. And whether that's xenophobia that's happening in South Africa. And I think with South Africa, in terms of xenophobia and, you know, it's kind of being a safe haven for queer people because of the constitution, I see Kenya in the same way, not necessarily with regards to, being a safe haven for queer people, but being revered for the constitution, but that not necessarily meaning that people actually have rights because of that constitution. Because we've seen, like, a lot of the extortion gangs that we're seeing in Kenya and Ghana. We're seeing that a lot in South Africa as well. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's safety for queer people just because there are constitutional rights. So there also being that interrogation of what does safety for queer people actually mean, and also us having like a better interrogation of also what exclusion means. We might not be excluding people from national identity because maybe they're not South African nationals. But if we're creating loopholes to question people's ability to integrate because we're saying that, either your identity is not real or you're lying about your identity, and so because of that you don't deserve to have, you know um, like you should not have access to safety from a place that you're fleeing persecution. I think, like, there's a lot for us to consider there.
I think I think you've touched on something really interesting there, Jamie, because the way I understand this refugee process, it comes from a place of wanting to give safe haven to groups of people, no matter what the reason is, from persecution or violence or genuine danger from their place of origin. And it's kind of, funnily enough, actually not funny at all, turned into this, um, uh, situation where people are starting to question, your identity and your right to exist, and your rights in general. And I think also what's interesting is what you're saying is that, we can both implore not implore, like, celebrate the constitutions that we have, but I think both of us know in the work that we do, and our colleagues in the work that we do know, that to make that promise of the Constitution real, we really have to fight for it, and we have to remind courts or politicians what the text says and how it should be interpreted. Because if you don't do that, things can get out of hand, scapegoating starts to happen, so on and so forth. We've been talking a lot about things in theory, a little bit about things maybe just slightly touching on them. So I want us to maybe take a step back and kind of bring in some, legal and socio-political context into the conversation. So in my work, I understand, for the refugee work that we do, I understand in Uganda there was the Anti-Homosexuality Act. I think that's the full name. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And then in Zimbabwe, in the constitution themselves, they have a clause basically outlawing same-sex marriage. Um, can you kind of give us a little bit more of a brief outline of how regional politics and law looks like in Africa, specifically around this anti-LGBTQIA rhetoric? And we've kind of spoken about it a little bit, but I want to kind of like let's start from the beginning and then we'll work back.
Yeah, so like most African countries will have provisions in their penal code or criminal code where they'll outlaw things like gross indecency or acts against the order of nature, which is basically most jurisdictions have interpreted to be consensual same sex acts, mostly between men, um, but which have been broadly interpreted to, collectively apply to LGBT people. So in Kenya, for example, we have provisions in our penal code that prohibit gross indecency and also consensual same sex acts between men. And, we don't have like it doesn't specifically outlaw maybe things like identifying as LGBTQ or saying that if you are an LGBT organization, you don't have the right to associate, or if you're creating LGBT content, that is prohibited. But we've seen government agencies weaponizing those provisions to like censor LGBT content in Africa. I mean, in Kenya. Like if we had the film Rafiki by Wanuri Kahiu a couple of years ago, which was banned in Kenya by the Kenya Film and Classification Board because they said, that homosexuality is illegal in Kenya and it is against Kenya's moral and cultural values, even though we have no law stating that. Um, We've also had situations where videos have been banned on YouTube because of the same reasons. And even some instances where some organizations have been denied registration because of that provision. So the same would apply in Uganda as well. Uganda also had the section of the penal code criminalizing consensual same-sex acts, but then now the Anti-Homosexuality Act came into force in 2023, and that obviously has expanded the criminalization beyond just sexual acts. So it bans things like advocacy, for example. So you can't do anything that they are calling the promotion of homosexuality. If you're an LGBT organization, you cannot register, you don't have the right to association. Even in terms of the right to assembly, if you are providing premises for people who are queer to congregate, that's also illegal now. And also, what they're calling the offense of homosexuality. So if you're caught doing things with other people of the same sex, that's also illegal. Um, and then it also has provisions on forcing conversion practices. So if you are maybe intersex, for example, you'll be forced to undergo a surgery to basically pick a gender, which is just completely insane. Um,
Crazy.
yeah, it's really bad. So we've noted that the laws in these anti-LGBT laws in Kenya, Ghana, and Uganda, the language is very similar. It's basically like they have the same template. Um, with the one in Ghana, though, which is very similar to the one in Kenya, in addition to them making the promotion of homosexuality illegal, there's also provisions that say that mention the social media companies specifically and say that they will be held criminally liable for the things that users post on their platforms, which obviously will put their safe harbor protections at risk because ideally they should be protected against criminal liability for that. So for us, why we say that that's dangerous is because it's going to incentivize platforms to not only more proactively surveil the things that people are posting online, but also to censor things that people are saying online so that they're not held criminally liable for that, which is really, really dangerous. But even as we were looking at the provisions on consensual same sex acts and the anti LGBT bills, we've also been looking at other legislations that, if these laws come into force, can put people at risk. For example, so like in Uganda, in addition to having the Anti-Homosexuality Act, there's also the Computer Misuse Act. And we've seen cases where people who maybe have been entrapped online have been arrested and charged under the Computer Misuse Act for things like cyber harassment, for sending messages to someone, and then that being used as evidence of, like someone entraps you online, you think that you're having a romantic conversation, and then they now try to blackmail you. If you refuse, they'll go to the police and report you and say that you're harassing them. So also noting the dangers of those kinds of cybercrime laws that can be used to, further criminalize and target LGBT people. We were also looking at cybercrime and cybersecurity laws, especially when it comes to things like maybe law enforcement sharing practices with companies. Because if the bill in Ghana, for example, because it has that specific provision on promotion of homosexuality and naming the social media platforms specifically, if a law like that comes into force, then that would mean that the things that it criminalizes when they happen online, that those things would now be considered to be cyber crimes. So if they're cyber crimes, then that means that it provides a cybersecurity authority with the authority to investigate these potential cyber crimes. So that would set people up for certain risks where, for example, the cybersecurity authority can issue a production order to a social media company to request for information about your account so that they can investigate you and charge you. If it's your telecommunication provider, maybe they can get an interception order so that they can spy on you, to see the things that you're saying online, who you're communicating with, and now that being used to charge you. So that's kind of the legal landscape in terms of the criminalization that we've been seeing related to anti LGBT repression in the region.
I think the framework that you've kind of identified for us here now, Jaimee, is exactly what we in the digital justice space are like trying to point out as one of the early signs of, authoritarian fascist, governance. We're seeing surveillance, we're seeing a deception of communication, we're seeing criminalization of identity. I mean, it's so clear to see, but then because the online world is so like huge that it's almost like sometimes not that easy to see. But I think what the work that you're doing is so important, and I want to go back a little bit because this entrapment thing is fascinating and horrifying, and I want to. So you mentioned, one-on-one private individuals entrapping each other, but is it true, or maybe is it possible that authorities themselves are also conducting these sort of entrapment ploys, I suppose you can say, online?
Yeah, so with Uganda, for example, our partner, the Human Rights Awareness and Promotion Forum, they've been documenting the violations since the Anti-Homosexuality Act came into force in 2023. So as of when we published the report last month, we had looked at over 1,000 cases that they documented, and we found like 89 cases of digital rights violations. So the majority of the cases of entrapment would be situations where, someone reaches out to them on a dating app or on social media, and then they are lured into meeting this person in person. And a lot of the times it would be right next to a police station. So when they go and meet these people in person, then the person comes to the police officer, then they're arrested. So in many cases, they would either be detained and charged, or in other cases, the police would confiscate their phones, go through their contacts and their messages, and then target other people with entrapment. And then the same thing happens. In other cases, in one case, the perpetrator who entrapped the victim, they took the victim's phone, they went through it, and then they doxed the victim to all of their contacts on their phone, which is just completely unimaginable. There was also a case, for example, where a landlord suspected that their worker was LGBT, and they provided housing to this worker on their premises. So they installed a CCTV camera in this person's room to record them being intimate with their partner, so that they could use that as blackmail and say that, if you don't pay me this amount of money, I'm going to report you to the police. So what we've noted that, like, it's the police working in tandem with people, or people also knowing and now being incentivized to, like, more proactively surveil and report people that they suspect of being queer. So even if they're not working with the police, they know that if I catch you, this can be used as digital evidence and I can report you. So if you don't pay me, I'm going to report you to the police. But in a lot of the cases, it was people working with the police and other security officials. But generally, we've the environment currently in Uganda is just like a very hyper vigilant and over surveilled space for queer people, which is obviously very, very concerning. And it would be really sad to see, that kind of dynamics spread in other countries, but Uganda is definitely providing a blueprint for people, for other authoritarian governments, about what that repression can look like, when it's really, really dangerous to see.
I think, what's quite sad about this, and specifically this entrapment thing, and it's going to sound like a crude example, but I promise you I have a deeper point here. My fiance and I, sometimes we turn on DSTV. It's the national sort of broadcasting channel in South Africa, and we watch the show called Catfish. And it's this thing in America. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I love cat,
And it's
ironically.
and it's it's so interesting because I would say about 90% of the time, the people that are catfishing are just lonely people who are trying to find some love. There's nothing insidious about what's genuine. Generally, there's nothing insidious behind the fake profile that they're making. What I'm seeing here is a real sort of, sad drop in our sort of ethics or morality here in society, because there's people, when you're pretending to be a romantic partner online, you actually have to sort of touch something quite deep, right? To be like, oh, how are you doing? You're so pretty. I really like the way you think. Your personality is really interesting to me. Like, to think that you would fake that just for some, political agenda is just bizarre to me. But I digress. And speaking of catfish, that's primarily in America. So I want us to move now into the international sort of framework, specifically around America, right? And we see a very similar trend of, anti-LGBTQIA rhetoric. And a lot of the movements or the organizations here in Africa, as maybe even just South Africa, and from my knowledge base, are funded from organizations that are coming out of America. These sort of, you mentioned these right-wing sort of conservative religious groups. We have very similar groups here in South Africa that are funded by those larger groups in America. And then you see the current US administration under Donald Trump making terrifying strides against these people. And so in South Africa specifically, he's cut US aid, right? And that's had huge impacts on the LGBTQIA community, because now those queer-friendly clinics, those clinics where HIV and AIDS treatment was being, given out at a low cost, if not a free cost, or lack of cost rather, it has been cut. Those clinics have been closed. There's nowhere for these people to go. And you can imagine now that that's even worse for refugee LGBTQIA persons. What I was really interesting when I was looking at some of the work that you've done, Jaimee, is that you guys had done this submission to the UN about the increasing challenges faced by the LGBTQIA persons, specifically within the international context. So could you talk us a little bit through what you guys found and then what you submitted to the UN?
Yeah, so we were looking generally at like anti-LGBT repression globally, whether this is with legislations that we are seeing coming up in different countries or with policies and practices from tech companies themselves, and looking specifically at issues impacting freedom of expression, the right to association, and right to assembly. So we looked at Africa, Middle East and Northern Africa, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and the US as well. So we were looking at different things. Obviously, the anti-LGBT bills. We mentioned the bill in Uganda that I've spoken about already, but we also looked at the law in Russia, which has kind of actually the blueprint of a lot of the legislations that we're seeing coming up in Africa, especially this framing of censoring LGBT content for the protection of children. That's the angle that the bills in Ghana, Kenya, and Uganda are using, and that's the framework that the one in Russia had used as well. When it first came up in 2013, they call it the gay propaganda law, basically. But it was a law that gay propaganda, isn't it ridiculous? But essentially, it was a law that would ban like if children are able to access content about the promotion of homosexuality online, then essentially that's what the law was going to ban. But the updated version that came up, I think in 2022, it was updated. So now it's a general ban on the promotion of homosexuality, whether this is accessible to children or not. So when this law came up in 2013, we've seen the Russia internet regulator issue a lot of takedown orders to social media companies to ban specific content. We've seen them issue takedown orders to TikTok, to Meta, even to Duolingo. It's so crazy.
Duolingo.
Yeah. So basically, issuing orders to these platforms to take down content that they are deeming to be, promotion of homosexuality and a danger to children or a danger to the morals of people in Russia. But then we've also seen situations where individual people have been targeted. For example, like someone was targeted because they posted a picture with a pride flag on it on Instagram, which is just insane. So we talked about that, but then we also talked about different laws also that carry different risks. Now that this gay propaganda law has also been passed, one of them was the sovereign internet law in Russia, which basically provides the government with the ability to use technology like deep packet inspections, which would allow them to filter and analyze internet traffic. And that would be dangerous, especially because, if they're filtering content, then that's how they're able to censor the content that people are able to access. But if they're analyzing internet traffic, then that means that they're also able to analyze the content that people are, seeking online, and through that being able to target people, which is really, really dangerous. But then we were also looking at, outside of anti-LGBT laws, there are certain legislations that states are passing that don't mention queerness specifically, but because they're so broad, they can be interpreted to to refer to them. So one of them, for example, would be the cybercrime law that was passed in Jordan in 2023. So this has penalties for things like inciting immorality or contempt for religion or exposing public immorality. So those are things that are very broad. And if people are saying that queerness is a violation or queerness is in opposition to cultural or moral values, then that gives the state grounds to censor or to target people based on that kind of on LGBT content that they're posting online. And another dangerous trend that we also noted is the banning of VPNs, which is virtual private networks, which people can use to circumvent censorship. So the Jordan 2023 cybercrime law has a ban on VPNs. But also, most recently, and this is something that we had documented in our Keep It On report, which is our internet shutdowns campaign, the banning of Grinder in Jordan, but in Tanzania as well. And also in Tanzania, there's now a law basically that forces people to have to register with the regulator if you want to use a VPN, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's a bit nuts.
Yeah. So that means that, like, if they ban Grinder and you want to use a VPN to you to try to access Grinder, then that essentially would be illegal because of that. But then we were also looking at companies practices, so things like companies establishing trusted flagger relationships with governments being really dangerous. We know that they'll say, for example, that it's something that they do to enable the prevention of crime and things like that through law enforcement assistance. But something that we have noted is when these trusted flagger relationships are very opaque, meaning that companies are not transparent about the frameworks or the processes, then it really enables a lot of government overreach. Like in Kenya, for example, there were reports that came out which revealed that the government had sat down with TikTok, and TikTok had agreed to censor LGBT content. And none of this was publicly reported by TikTok. We don't have, any transparency reporting on what that framework looks like and even what that enforcement of that agreement has looked like since it came into force, which is really concerning. And so when we have those gaps in transparency, then it makes it really easy for the government basically to exploit their power to get companies either to censor content or to access information unlawfully, which is really, really dangerous. But yeah, that was mostly what we were looking at in the submission.
Did the UN come back to you at all, or did you get any? Have you gotten any response from that yet?
Yeah, so the independent expert published his report, I think a couple of months later. I can share that with you if you're interested, but it included obviously the recommendations and the issues that we had documented in our submission, and as well as like all of the other organizations that had submitted as well, which was really good to see because I think, especially with the Office of the Independent Expert, it's good to see that, there's more of a focus on tech, which we haven't really seen before. And I hope that that's something that continues. And I think something that I really liked to see also was the recognition of the weaponization of censoring or restricting LGBT rights for the protection of children, that's something that is being recognized as a tactic of repression, because it definitely is. They know that if they bring up kids, people will be very incensed and it will be very difficult to oppose that, because now people will ask, so do you not want children to be protected? That's not what we're saying. We're saying that queer people are not a danger to children, and it's not something that should be weaponized to restrict people's rights. So I'm really glad to see that that's something that was noted, and I hope that there will be, um, more thematic reports from the independent expert on tech issues. But I think it's a good start at least.
And I think also this is a really important time in the regional and international political space because so you guys have done this submission to the UN. We're currently working with a whole group of organizations, and I think Jaimee, your input on this as well would be really helpful. So I'm definitely going to try and get you involved in this work that we're trying to do with the current resolutions that have been passed with the African Commission for Humans and People's Rights. That's about, digital integrity, data harvesting, all of that, those things. And the special rapporteur is looking to do consultations on that. And I think what comes out of that process is going to be really important. And also, I think more importantly, the enforcement of whatever that process looks like at the end will be better. Because I think ultimately, where within the state we're kind of lacking a little bit of hope, we're really relying now on these international regional spaces to kind of pull the weight, or maybe to realign direction in terms of a more human rights based approach. I've never been super hopeful with the UN and the African Commission, but I mean, let's see, touch wood, we'll see. I want to move on a little bit now, because I think we've been touching on a lot of very, hard and dark topics. And I think without, trying to avoid that conversation, I also think that we need to leave the listeners with a little bit of, hope, but also some tips and tricks. But I want to be a bit selfish for a second and ask you for a personal tip. That plant in the background is super luscious, and I would love your gardening techniques. Is it just water it?
It's funny because most of my plants are actually dying. I do not know how this plant is still alive. So the tip and the trick is to buy plants that refuse to die. That is the trick.
Yeah, we need plants that can look after themselves, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, but on a serious note, Jaimee, Access Now and your work, you've got an incredible set of guidelines and suggestions for how activists and LGBTQIA persons can and protect themselves, or just find safety online. I know this is on your website, and we're going to link all the important things below. But what I want to ask is if you can kind of give us sort of highlights from your tips and tricks, and just so if people are listening and are too lazy to type in a URL, they can hear it here first.
Yeah, so when I was doing the documentation for the reports, part of it obviously was to have a better understanding of the risks that people are facing online, but also trying to figure out how our digital security helpline can provide support in response to the threats that people are experiencing online. So, through that, we were able to come up with a digital safety guide for LGBT activists in Africa. And I'm really glad to see that some of our partners have been using them for trainings. That's what we made it for. So we really love that it's become useful to the community, and we hope that that's something that continues. But basically, we identified, I think, about like five risks that we thought like were the most, no, there were four risks, yeah. So four risks that would come up a lot in the documentation that we had been doing. So entrapment and blackmail obviously being the main one, and that being a risk that people have to face, whether that's from state or non-state actors. And then obviously the online harassment. We've had situations where activists, especially our partners, because of the work that they do and it being so visible, have faced a lot of harassment online because of that. So we thought it would be really important to include that in the safety tips. And then with spyware or arrests, something also that came up is activists being at risk of raids by the police when these laws pass. That came up a lot, especially with our partners in Uganda, and account hacking as well. So we outlined different personas under the different risks. We thought it would kind of be a good way to make the risks more accessible, because we also know that the information that we're giving can be very technical and difficult to understand. So we wanted to make it as accessible as possible. So each of the different risks has a different persona, and then has an explanation about how people can mitigate different risks depending can mitigate the risks that they're experiencing depending on that persona. So with entrapment and blackmail, for example, we have this, but we also have a specific safe dating guide that goes more in depth for risks of entrapment and doxing. But on the digital safety guide, we'll say, for example, don't use personally identifiable information. Like, don't go on Grindr and put all your government names on there. Nobody needs to know that. Um, don't post pictures of yourself with identifiable features like I have like a very distinct tattoo of Mojo Jojo. So if someone sees a picture of that on a dating app, they'll probably know it's me. Um, so I probably wouldn't post a picture of that if it's able to identify me. Um, then doing things like clearing metadata from your photos, and even as someone that works in the tech space, this is something that I had to learn recently. Like, you're posting a picture online and it has all of this information attached to it, and you'd had no idea. So doing things like clearing your metadata so that you're not sharing information maybe about like your location or other things that people can use to identify you would be a good thing.
Could you could
And
you
something.
could you tell us how to clear our metadata? Because like you just said, I've just learned this now. I mean, I always knew that there was locations attached to it and little bits of
Mhm.
pieces, but how does one
Yeah.
say, make this just a photo for me, please?
I think you go to, if you're on Apple, I think you do it through your privacy settings, if I'm not wrong. So like if you scroll up, you'll notice that like it has some information like about the kind of picture that you take, and sometimes even the location, the date and stuff like that. Um, so you can go to settings and remove that on the privacy settings so that it's not oh, am I back? I think it had disconnected. Yep,
No, no,
okay.
no. You're fine. You're fine.
Yeah. So you can change that on your settings so that you're not giving people anything and everything about yourself. Um, and then in terms of like choosing a safe location, so what we've noticed with the cases that our partner in Ghana has been documenting, for example, will be situations where these, and I'm sure this is the same thing that's happening in South Africa, where like the extortion gangs, they'll target people online, try to get you to meet somewhere in person, maybe like in an abandoned area or something, and then they'll kidnap you and do really terrible things, and then later try to blackmail you. So choosing a safe location is really, really important. Maybe not even going by yourself for the first, if you're meeting someone for the first time, make sure that it's in a public place. Make sure that it's not somewhere where someone can, waylay you by yourself, and also share your location with other people so that if anything happens, they're able to find you. But yeah, so those are just some of the tips, but people can find more information on the safety guide, and we can share the safe dating guide as well. And we have a self doxing guide, which is a bit very technical, but we're really trying to figure out how to make the resources more accessible to people.
Thank you, Jamie, and for everyone listening and also watching. We'll link all of this stuff below, so please go and check it out. I think it's really important. And Jamie and Access Now, the team there, have done some incredible work doing that. And I just want to say, I know that the topic, and it got quite dark, and it was maybe a little bit trauma-inducing. And I know that when we're behind the keyboard and we're looking at the online space, sometimes the negativity online can seem like it's overpowering everything. I hope that this episode and the episodes in the past have shown everyone that like there are people in the world like Jaimee who are doing incredible work to cut through the bullshit and effectively, you know, remind everyone that there are people out there that are fighting against the grain on this stuff. And for me personally, and I haven't told this to my colleagues, but I'll tell them as soon as I get back in the office later on today, people like Jaimee, people like my colleagues, they give me hope. They give me energy to keep doing this stuff, and I hope that it does the same for you guys. So without saying anything more and stealing any more of the spotlight on that topic, I want to give Jaimee the sort of red carpet in a sense. Jaimee, can you tell us where I can find you in the next couple of months, maybe a year? What is Access Now What is Access Now doing in the next up and coming months?
Yeah, so you can find me at I think maybe you can link my email address below, but it's jaimee@accessnow.org if you want to reach out to me to talk a bit more about the work that we're doing. But we have more reports coming out this year. We have one on Ghana and the issues that we've been documenting since 2021 coming out soon, that will have like an assessment of the legal framework in Ghana, and also the social media platforms and the recommendations that we have for them with regards to the entrapment and online hate and violence that we've been documenting. Also, RightsCon, which is our annual digital rights conference, is coming to Africa next year. We will be announcing where it is going to be very soon. But that's a space that I'm hoping to see a lot of people working on queer rights and queer issues in the region engaging more on. And I understand that, you know, it's been difficult to maybe participate in RightsCon previously because, you know, maybe where it's been held has been difficult for people to access. So I'm really glad that it's coming to Africa next year so that we can have, you know, more of our people there. So I'm really looking forward to seeing a lot of concept notes coming from people in the region. Please, please, please. I want to see all of them. Yeah, but other than that, yeah, just follow us on social media at Access Now on Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky if you're on there, to keep up with what we're doing. And yeah, we'll be releasing a lot of interesting things very soon.
Jaimee, thank you so much for joining us today. It was so wonderful to talk to you. And I hope that we can, you know, collaborate on more work. And I hope that people get in touch with you because, you know, the work that you're doing is incredible.
Thank you for tuning in to Legal Resources Radio. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and gained some valuable insights. If you did, or even if you didn't, please remember to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Legal Resources SA, or visit our website at lrc.org.za for updates and exclusive content on the incredible work our team is doing. We'll see you on the next episode of Legal Resources Radio. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep up the good fight.